Every day, Elijah walked miles under the blistering sun, carrying bags of groceries for his neighbors. What he didn't know was that his life was about to change in ways he never imagined. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Elijah Carter's alarm buzzed at 5 a.m. sharp, as it did every morning. He stretched his arms, yawned, and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the streets outside his small apartment were still bathed in darkness. Elijah's days began early and ended late, and each one started with the same ritual, a quiet moment where he mentally prepared himself for the long day ahead. As he dressed, he glanced at the worn pair of shoes by the door. The soles were thinning, evidence of the many miles he had walked in them. Elijah didn't have much money to replace them, but that didn't bother him. For years, he had managed to get by with what little he had, focusing instead on helping others. That was the life he had chosen, and it was one he had come to accept. Elijah's neighborhood wasn't exactly affluent, but it was filled with people who cared for each other. He had lived here for most of his life, and in recent years, he had taken on a role that had come to define him. He was the person who made sure that the elderly in his community had food. What began as a favor for one neighbor after her surgery had turned into something much larger. Several years ago, after losing his job as a mechanic due to layoffs, Elijah found himself at a crossroads. With no steady work and limited prospects, he struggled to make ends meet. During this difficult time, he noticed something about his community. Many of the older residents were struggling even more than he was. Some couldn't drive, others were homebound due to illness, and many had no family to help. They couldn't get to the grocery store, and food deliveries were expensive. Elijah saw this and couldn't stand by and do nothing. So he started walking groceries to them. At first, it was just a few bags here and there for Miss Jenkins, the kind woman who lived 3 doors down, and Mr. Saunders, the retired school teacher who had no relatives nearby. But word spread, and soon, more people began to ask for help. Now, his mornings were spent picking up grocery orders, meticulously packing them into the reusable bags he carried, and walking from house to house, delivering the essentials to people who desperately needed them. He didn't ask for payment. Most of the seniors barely had enough to cover their own needs. Instead, Elijah accepted their gratitude and felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he was doing something that mattered. This morning was no different. He pulled on his shoes, grabbed his list of deliveries, and stepped out into the early morning light. As he walked to the local grocery store, his legs felt the familiar ache, a constant reminder of the miles he had covered. The walk to the store took about 30 minutes, and by the time he arrived, the shop was just opening. Elijah greeted the employees warmly. They all knew him by name. After all, he was in there almost every day, collecting orders for the seniors in his neighborhood. Once inside, he began gathering the groceries. He moved swiftly through the aisles, picking up everything from fresh produce to canned goods and cleaning supplies. His mind was always on the people he served. He knew their preferences by heart. Miss Jenkins liked bananas, but not too ripe. Mr. Saunders preferred whole-grain bread. Elijah made sure he got it all right, because to him, these small details mattered. They were his way of showing care. As he loaded up his bags, Elijah's thoughts drifted to the people he had helped over the years. Some had passed on, others had moved away, but their faces remained etched in his memory. It wasn't just about the groceries. It was about the connection, the conversations they had when he delivered their items. Many of these seniors were lonely, and Elijah had become a lifeline for them. Sometimes, his visits were the only human interaction they had all week. With the bags full, Elijah slung them over his shoulders and began the long walk to his first stop. The route was familiar, but that didn't make it any less difficult. His shoes slapped against the pavement, the bags weighing down on his arms. It was tough, but Elijah didn't complain. He couldn't afford a car, and even if he could, the maintenance and gas costs would be too much. So he walked. Every day. Rain, shine, or snow, he walked. His first stop was Miss Jenkins' house. The frail elderly woman opened the door with a smile when she saw Elijah standing there with her groceries. "Oh, Elijah, thank you so much, dear. I don't know what I'd do without you," she said warmly. Elijah returned her smile and handed over the bags. "It's no problem, Miss Jenkins. How are you feeling today?" They talked for a few minutes, as they always did. Elijah listened attentively as Miss Jenkins recounted her latest doctor's visit and shared stories from her youth. Though she tried to make it light-hearted, Elijah could hear the loneliness in her voice. He stayed longer than he probably should have, but he didn't mind. His schedule was flexible, and these moments of conversation were just as important as the groceries themselves. After saying his goodbyes, Elijah moved on to the next house. It was a similar scene: grateful faces, small conversations, and the constant hum of appreciation for what he was doing. By the time he finished his last delivery, it was late afternoon. His legs felt like lead, his arms ached, and his stomach rumbled from the lack of a proper meal. But as he walked back home, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the recognition. Most people had no idea what Elijah did every day. It wasn't about the money either. He didn't earn anything for his efforts, aside from the occasional tip, which he would usually refuse. No, for Elijah, it was about something deeper. It was about being there for people who needed someone. It was about showing that even in a world where people often forgot to look out for each other, there were still those who cared. As he neared his apartment, Elijah noticed the wear on his shoes again. They would need replacing soon, but he wasn't sure how he'd afford it. Still, he pushed the thought aside. He'd figure it out, just like he always had. After all, there were groceries to deliver tomorrow. And no matter how hard the journey got, Elijah knew one thing: he wasn't going to stop. Tomorrow would be another day, another walk, and another chance to make sure no one went without. Little did Elijah know, tomorrow would also bring a life-changing encounter. One that would set in motion a series of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone in his community. But for now, as the sun set on another day, Elijah was content with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. As he lay down to sleep that night, he couldn't have known that his days of walking alone were coming to an end, and that soon he would have more help than he ever imagined. The following day began like any other for Elijah. He awoke before dawn, his body accustomed to the early rise, though the fatigue from yesterday's miles still lingered. The city was stirring to life as he dressed, once again slipping into his worn-out shoes. With his usual sense of determination, Elijah gathered his list of grocery deliveries and set out, making the now familiar trek to the grocery store. Despite the repetition of his routine, Elijah didn't find it monotonous. The streets, the faces, and the stops along his route were always a little different. He knew his purpose was important, and that gave him the strength to keep going, even on the hardest days. Today, the sky was overcast, with a slight breeze that made the miles ahead feel a little less daunting. As Elijah approached the grocery store, he passed by a small row of local businesses. This was a busier part of town, filled with people on their way to work, opening their shops, or grabbing their morning coffee. Elijah usually passed through without incident, but today was different. As he walked, a man standing outside one of the stores, a hardware shop, watched him. The man was Marcus Green, the owner of the store. Marcus had seen Elijah before. Over the past few months, he'd noticed Elijah walking by almost every day, carrying heavy bags of groceries. At first, Marcus thought nothing of it, just another local running errands. But over time, he became curious. Why was this man always walking? And why did he always seem to be carrying so much? On this particular morning, as Elijah passed by with his bags loaded down, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know more. Something about the way Elijah carried himself, with quiet determination and purpose, stood out. Marcus had a gut feeling that there was a story behind those long walks, and it was time to find out. "Hey man," Marcus called out as Elijah walked by. Elijah turned, a little surprised. It wasn't often that strangers stopped him while he was on his route. He saw Marcus standing by the entrance of the hardware store, waving him over. Though a bit puzzled, Elijah walked up to him, shifting the weight of the grocery bags on his shoulders. "You need something from the store?" Elijah asked politely, thinking maybe Marcus was mistaking him for a customer. No, Marcus replied with a friendly grin. "I've seen you walking by here a lot, always carrying those bags. Just curious, what's your deal?" What are you doing out here every day? Elijah hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to talking about what he did. For him, it wasn't something that required attention or praise. But Marcus seemed genuinely curious, so Elijah explained. I deliver groceries to some of the elderly folks around the neighborhood, Elijah began. A lot of them can't get out to the store themselves, and they don't really have anyone to help them. So, I pick up their orders and bring them over. It's not much, but it helps them out. Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had expected something more ordinary, maybe that Elijah was a personal shopper or doing deliveries for some app. But this was different. This was a man, walking miles each day, out of the goodness of his heart, helping people who couldn't help themselves. That's incredible, man, Marcus said, shaking his head in disbelief. You're doing all that on foot? Every day? Elijah nodded, shifting the bags again. Yeah, it's just walking. I don't mind it. I mean, it's hard sometimes, but I don't have a car, and this is the only way to get it done. They need the groceries, so I walk. Marcus stared at him for a moment, taking in the full weight of what Elijah had just said. He thought about the miles Elijah must have covered, day after day, week after week. It was clear that Elijah wasn't doing this for recognition or reward. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. You're doing more than just walking, Marcus finally said. You're taking care of people. I mean, this is serious stuff, Elijah. These people depend on you. Elijah gave a modest shrug, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. I guess I'm just trying to do what I can. Someone has to, you know? The simplicity of his statement hit Marcus harder than he expected. Here was a man, without much to his name, giving everything he had to help others, and doing so without expecting anything in return. Marcus felt a stirring inside him, a sense of urgency that he couldn't quite explain. He wanted to do something. He needed to do something. You know what? Marcus said after a pause, the idea forming in his mind as he spoke. Why don't I give you a ride? I'm not doing much right now, and it's the least I can do. I've got my truck parked around the back. It'll make things easier for you, at least today. Elijah hesitated. He wasn't used to asking for help, let alone accepting it from someone he barely knew. But as he looked at the bags hanging from his arms and thought about the miles still ahead, he realized how much of a relief it would be to have a ride. Just this once. You don't have to do that, Elijah said, his voice full of humility. But if you're offering, I'd really appreciate it. Of course, Marcus replied enthusiastically. Hop in, and we'll get those groceries delivered. Marcus led Elijah to his truck, a well-maintained older model that still ran like a charm. Elijah loaded the grocery bags into the back and climbed into the passenger seat, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and awkwardness. It wasn't often that someone went out of their way for him. Usually, he was the one helping others. As they drove through the neighborhood, Elijah pointed out the houses along his route, and Marcus listened intently, asking questions about the people Elijah served. Elijah shared stories of the seniors he delivered to, their personalities, and how much they relied on the deliveries. As he talked, Marcus felt his admiration for Elijah grow. It wasn't just the physical effort Elijah put in, it was the compassion behind it, the genuine care he had for each person. When they reached Miss Jenkins' house, Marcus insisted on helping carry the groceries to the door. The elderly woman beamed when she saw Elijah, as she always did. Elijah, my dear, thank you again. You're my guardian angel, she said, her frail voice full of affection. Elijah introduced Marcus as the man who had kindly offered him a ride. Miss Jenkins smiled warmly at Marcus, her eyes twinkling with gratitude. You're a good man for helping him out, she said. We're lucky to have Elijah. I don't know what we'd do without him. As they continued the deliveries, Marcus couldn't help but notice how much of an impact Elijah had on these people. Every door they knocked on opened to a smiling face, a grateful voice, and a sense of relief that someone was there to help. By the time they finished, Marcus had a clear picture of just how vital Elijah was to the community. On the drive back, the conversation grew quieter, but Marcus's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the thought of how Elijah was doing all of this without a car, walking miles every day, carrying bags for people who barely knew his name. It wasn't right. Marcus knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. As they pulled up to Elijah's apartment, Marcus turned to him and said, Listen, Elijah, what you're doing is incredible, but it shouldn't be this hard for you. I want to help. I don't know exactly how yet, but I want to do something that makes it easier for you to keep helping these people. Elijah, tired from the day, but grateful for the ride, gave Marcus a small smile. I appreciate that, Marcus, but I've been managing this long. I don't mind the walking. I know you don't mind, Marcus replied, but that doesn't mean you should have to do it alone. Let me think on it, okay? I'll get back to you. Elijah nodded, unsure of what Marcus had in mind, but touched by his offer. As Marcus drove away, Elijah couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. It wasn't often that someone stepped in to offer help. And while Elijah wasn't sure what Marcus was planning, he had a feeling that it was the beginning of something bigger than either of them could have predicted. And he was right. The following week was business as usual for Elijah. Early mornings, long walks, and the steady routine of gathering groceries and delivering them to the seniors in his community. But something had changed. As much as Elijah tried to put Marcus's words out of his mind, they lingered, taking root in his thoughts. What did Marcus mean by doing something to help? Elijah wasn't used to people offering assistance, let alone following through on it. A few days after their encounter, Elijah found himself walking through the business district again, bags heavy on his shoulders. He passed Marcus's hardware store, half expecting to see him standing outside, but the shop seemed quiet. With a slight sigh of relief, Elijah continued on his route. As much as he appreciated the offer of help, he wasn't sure how to accept it. He had always been self-reliant, making do with what he had. The idea of someone stepping in to change that was unfamiliar, and part of him wondered if it would come with strings attached. Later that afternoon, as Elijah was finishing his last delivery, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Hesitant, he answered. "Hello?" Elijah said cautiously. "Elijah, it's Marcus. You got a minute?" Elijah smiled to himself, recognizing the enthusiasm in Marcus's voice. "Hey, Marcus. Sure, I'm just finishing up for the day. What's up?" "I've been thinking about our conversation," Marcus said, a hint of excitement in his tone. "I've got an idea, and I wanted to run it by you. Can we meet up tomorrow? Say around lunchtime?" Elijah's curiosity piqued, and though he still felt unsure about accepting help, he agreed. "Sure, I can meet you. Where at?" "There's a diner on 12th Street, best burgers in town. I'll meet you there at noon. Sound good?" "Sounds good," Elijah replied, still wondering what Marcus was up to. After hanging up, he couldn't help but feel a small flicker of anticipation. Maybe this would turn out to be nothing, just an idea Marcus had that wouldn't pan out. But maybe it would be something more. The next day, Elijah showed up at the diner promptly at noon. Marcus was already seated in a booth near the window, waving him over with a big grin. Elijah slid into the booth across from him, noting the way Marcus seemed almost too eager, as if he could barely contain his excitement. "Good to see you, Elijah," Marcus said, extending a hand. "Hope you're hungry. The food here is worth every penny." Elijah smiled politely, though his stomach was too tied up in knots to think about food. He was more interested in hearing what Marcus had to say. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," Marcus began, leaning forward in his seat. "About how you walk all those miles every day, carrying groceries for people who need help. What you're doing is amazing, but it shouldn't be that hard. So I started thinking, why don't we make it easier for you?" Elijah raised an eyebrow, unsure of where Marcus was headed. "I appreciate that, Marcus, but I don't see how." Before Elijah could finish, Marcus held up a hand, his grin widening. "Let me stop you there. I know you're humble, and you don't want to ask for anything. But here's the thing. I've been talking to some people, and I've got an idea. What if I bought you a van?" Elijah blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. "A van?" he echoed, trying to process the offer. Marcus nodded, his enthusiasm unwavering. "Yeah, a delivery van. Something you can use to make your rounds, so you don't have to walk everywhere. It'll cut your time in half, and you can help more people without wearing yourself out." Elijah stared at Marcus, his mind racing. He had never considered something like this. A van would change everything. He wouldn't have to spend hours on foot, lugging heavy bags across town. But still, the idea felt too big, too much. "I don't know, Marcus," Elijah said slowly. I appreciate the offer, I really do, but that's a lot. I wouldn't feel right taking something like that. I've been doing this on foot for years. It's hard, but I've managed. Marcus leaned back in his seat, clearly expecting this hesitation. I get it. You're used to doing everything yourself, but you've got to think about the bigger picture, Elijah. What you're doing isn't just about you. It's about all the people you're helping. With a van, you could reach more people, help more families. And it's not just about now. This could grow into something bigger, something that lasts. You don't have to do this alone. Elijah shifted in his seat, conflicted. He had never thought of his deliveries as something that could be more than what they were, a personal mission to help his neighbors. But Marcus's words planted a seed of possibility. Could he really expand what he was doing? Could he reach more people, make a bigger impact? The idea was both exhilarating and overwhelming. And listen, Marcus continued, sensing Elijah's hesitation. I'm not just offering you a van and walking away. I want to help you set something up. Something official. We could start a nonprofit, get the community involved. You wouldn't be doing this alone anymore. There are people out there who would love to help, but they don't know how. You've already got the heart for it. Let's give you the tools to make it bigger. Elijah sat back, his mind reeling. He had never considered starting a nonprofit. He wasn't even sure what that entailed. But Marcus was right about one thing. There were a lot of people in the community who needed help, more than Elijah could reach on foot. The idea of having a van, of being able to deliver groceries to more people in less time, was undeniably appealing. But there was still a part of him that resisted. Accepting help felt like admitting he couldn't do it on his own, and Elijah had always prided himself on his independence. He had spent years walking those miles, pushing through the exhaustion, because he believed it was his responsibility. Could he really let someone else step in and make things easier? I don't know what to say, Elijah finally admitted. It's a lot to think about. I get that, Marcus said, his tone understanding. I'm not asking you to decide right this minute. Take your time, think about it. But just know, Elijah, you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. There are people who want to help, me included, and you deserve it. You've been doing something incredible for years. Let us make it easier for you. Elijah nodded, still processing everything. The food arrived, and though Elijah wasn't particularly hungry, he forced himself to eat, partly to give himself time to think. The idea of having a van, of expanding his work into something bigger, was tempting, but it was also scary. What if it didn't work? What if people didn't want to help? And what if accepting Marcus's offer changed things in ways he wasn't prepared for? By the time they finished their meal, Elijah still didn't have an answer. Marcus didn't press him, though. Instead, as they left the diner, Marcus clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder and smiled. Take your time, Elijah. Think it over. But just know, whatever you decide, I'm here to help. Elijah walked home that afternoon with a weight on his shoulders that had nothing to do with the groceries he carried. Marcus's offer hung in the air, a possibility that both excited and terrified him. He knew one thing for sure. If he accepted, his life and the lives of the people he helped would never be the same. The question was, could he take that leap? The next few days passed in a blur for Elijah. He kept to his routine, up at dawn, walking miles to the grocery store, picking up bags and delivering them to the people in his neighborhood. But Marcus's offer lingered in the back of his mind. Each step felt heavier, each mile longer, as Elijah grappled with the decision he knew he would eventually have to make. A van. A way to help more people, to ease the burden of his daily treks, and to expand the impact of his efforts. It sounded incredible, too good to be true almost. But with that possibility came a deep sense of uncertainty. Elijah had spent so long doing things on his own, relying on nothing but his determination and willingness to walk those miles. Could he let go of that control and accept help? More importantly, could he trust that things would still feel as meaningful if they became easier? One evening, as Elijah was preparing for the next day's deliveries, his phone buzzed again. It was Marcus. Hey, Elijah, Marcus began, his voice upbeat. I just wanted to check in and see how you were feeling about everything. No pressure, just curious. Elijah hesitated for a moment before responding. I've been thinking about it a lot, Honestly, it sounds amazing. I've never done anything like that before. It feels like a big change. I get it, Marcus said, his tone reassuring. It is a big change, but sometimes big changes are exactly what we need, especially when we're already doing something great. Look, Elijah, I'm not asking you to let go of what you've built. I'm offering to help you grow it. You're already helping people. You could help even more with the right tools. Elijah let out a slow breath, trying to let Marcus's words sink in. You're right. I know that. It's a lot to wrap my head around, but I think I'm ready to give it a shot. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Marcus let out a joyful laugh. That's what I wanted to hear. Trust me, Elijah, you won't regret this. How about we meet up tomorrow? I found a van that I think would be perfect for you, and if you're up for it, we can go check it out. Elijah smiled to himself, feeling a sense of relief and excitement that surprised him. All right, let's do it. The next day, Elijah met Marcus at a small dealership on the edge of town. The air was crisp, and there was a buzz of anticipation as they approached a sleek, used delivery van parked near the entrance. It wasn't brand new, but it was in great condition, clean, reliable, and spacious enough to handle the bags of groceries Elijah delivered daily. What do you think? Marcus asked, grinning as he gestured toward the van. Elijah walked around it slowly, running his hands over the smooth surface, peering inside at the clean interior. It felt surreal, standing in front of something that could change his entire operation. For years, his feet had been his only mode of transportation, but now he could see a different path. One that didn't involve hours of walking or aching muscles at the end of every day. It's perfect, Elijah said quietly, still a little overwhelmed by it all. Great, I've already worked out the details with the dealership, Marcus said, handing the keys to Elijah. It's yours, no strings attached. Elijah stared at the keys in his hand, barely able to believe what was happening. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes full of gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. It's going to change everything. Marcus clapped him on the back. You don't have to thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing, helping people. That's thanks enough for me. The first time Elijah drove the van, it felt like stepping into a new world. The familiar streets rolled by much faster than he was used to, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the grocery bags pulling on his shoulders. With the van, Elijah was able to complete his deliveries in a fraction of the time. He quickly realized how much more efficient his process had become, and how many more people he could reach. But the van was just the beginning. Word of Marcus's generosity and Elijah's mission spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Soon, people who had never known about Elijah's efforts began reaching out, offering to help in whatever way they could. Local grocery stores donated food, while volunteers signed up to help with deliveries or assist in organizing the orders. One Saturday morning, as Elijah was preparing for his rounds, he noticed a small group of people standing outside his apartment. They were neighbors, volunteers from different parts of the community, and even some of the elderly residents he had been delivering groceries to for years. They had all come together, unprompted, to help. What's all this? Elijah asked, stepping out to greet the group. Miss Jenkins, one of the seniors Elijah had been helping for years, smiled at him warmly. We heard about what you and Marcus are doing, Elijah, and we wanted to be a part of it. You've been taking care of all of us for so long. Now it's our turn to help you. Elijah was speechless. He had never imagined that his small act of service would grow into something so much bigger, or that so many people would rally around him to support the cause. But there they were, ready to lend a hand, ready to give back. That day marked the unofficial beginning of something much larger than Elijah had ever anticipated. With the help of Marcus and the community, Elijah established a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing groceries and essential supplies to seniors and families in need. What had once been a one-man mission to help a few neighbors was now a full-fledged operation, with volunteers, delivery vans, and a growing network of supporters. Elijah named the organization Miles of Care, a nod to the long walks he had taken over the years and the care that had always driven him forward. The name resonated with the community, and soon, Donations and support began pouring in from local businesses and individuals who wanted to be a part of something meaningful. As the organization grew, Elijah found himself busier than ever, but in a different way. Instead of walking miles every day, he was coordinating volunteers, organizing food drives, and expanding the reach of Miles of Care to other neighborhoods. It was a lot of work, but Elijah felt fulfilled in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't just delivering groceries. He was building something that could truly change lives. Months passed, and the impact of Miles of Care continued to grow. What had started as one man's quiet mission had become a community-wide effort. Families who had once struggled to put food on the table were now receiving regular deliveries, and seniors who had been isolated and alone now had a support system they could rely on. One afternoon, Elijah sat in his small office at the newly opened Miles of Care Center, surrounded by volunteers packing grocery bags for the next round of deliveries. He looked out the window at the van parked outside, the same van that Marcus had given him all those months ago, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Marcus walked into the office, a smile on his face as he saw the bustling activity. "I told you this would be big," he said with a chuckle. Elijah smiled back. "I never would have imagined this. Not in a million years." "You made this happen, Elijah. You and that crazy determination of yours. All I did was give you a van." "You did more than that," Elijah said, shaking his head. "You believed in me, and that made all the difference." Marcus grinned. "Well, I wasn't wrong, was I?" Elijah laughed, feeling the weight of those long, exhausting walks lift from his shoulders completely. He had come a long way from the days of carrying groceries on foot, but in many ways, the journey was just beginning. With the support of his community, Elijah knew that Miles of Care would continue to grow, helping more people than he ever could have imagined. And while the van had started the movement, it was the heart and soul of the community that would keep it going for years to come. Years had passed since the day Marcus handed Elijah the keys to that van, but the memory was still vivid in Elijah's mind. What had started as a humble, personal mission to help a few elderly neighbors had blossomed into something far bigger than he ever could have imagined. Miles of Care had become a cornerstone of the community, a lifeline for thousands of families who relied on the steady supply of groceries and the network of support that Elijah had built. Elijah stood outside the Miles of Care Community Center, watching as volunteers loaded groceries into a fleet of delivery vans, now a dozen strong. The sight of it all still filled him with awe. He had never set out to start an organization, to create a movement, or to lead others. Yet here he was, at the helm of something that had grown beyond him, driven by the same compassion and sense of responsibility that had led him to walk miles every day carrying groceries on his back. As he looked around, Elijah saw familiar faces, people he had helped in those early days, now standing alongside new volunteers who had joined the cause. The elderly residents who had once been dependent on his deliveries were now part of the community too, contributing in ways they could, sharing stories, and offering support to others in need. The center had become more than just a place for deliveries. It was a hub of connection, a symbol of the kindness that Elijah had sparked. Inside the center, Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing some paperwork for the next food drive. Donations had been steady, thanks to the local businesses that had joined forces with Miles of Care. The grocery stores and local markets had begun to donate surplus food regularly. And with the nonprofit's expanded reach, Elijah and his team had been able to distribute far beyond their original neighborhood. What had once been a small operation was now servicing entire communities, making sure that no one went hungry. But it wasn't just about food anymore. Miles of Care had grown to encompass other forms of support as well. Volunteers offered companionship to elderly residents who were isolated, visiting them regularly to make sure they didn't feel alone. Clothing drives, educational workshops, and community gatherings were all part of the growing mission. Elijah hadn't just started an organization. He had built a network of people who genuinely cared about one another, and that was more powerful than he ever could have anticipated. A knock at the door pulled Elijah from his thoughts. It was Marcus, as energetic as ever, despite the years that had passed since he first stepped into Elijah's life. Marcus had become more than just a partner in the venture. He was a true friend and a mentor, guiding Elijah as miles of care grew, always encouraging him to dream bigger. "You ready for the big meeting?" Marcus asked, stepping inside with a grin. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Meeting?" Marcus laughed. "Don't tell me you forgot. We've got a presentation with the city council this afternoon about expanding miles of care into more neighborhoods. This is big, Elijah. It could mean more funding, more resources, and more volunteers." Elijah nodded, feeling the familiar mix of excitement and nerves. The idea of expanding their reach was thrilling, but it also brought a wave of responsibility. He had never imagined himself in this kind of position, speaking before city officials, advocating for a cause that had grown far beyond his original vision. But Marcus's confidence in him was infectious, and over the years Elijah had learned to trust in the strength of what they had built together. Later that afternoon, Elijah and Marcus sat in the city council chambers, waiting for their turn to present. Elijah had prepared his speech carefully, but the nerves still buzzed in his chest. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a reassuring nod. When their names were called, they walked to the front of the room together, standing before the council and the gathered audience. Elijah took a deep breath and began. "Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak today. My name is Elijah Carter, and I'm the founder of Miles of Care, a nonprofit organization that started in this very community. It began as a simple act, walking groceries to elderly neighbors who couldn't get to the store themselves. But over time, it grew into something much bigger. Thanks to the support and generosity of people like Marcus Green and everyone in our community who has come together to help those in need." Elijah paused, scanning the faces in the room. He saw a mix of curiosity and interest, and he continued, finding strength in his story. "Today, we serve thousands of families, delivering groceries and essentials to those who can't afford them or can't access them. We provide companionship for seniors, support for families, and a sense of community for everyone involved. But we know there's more work to be done. Hunger and isolation aren't problems limited to one neighborhood, and we believe that Miles of Care can reach more people, help more families, and build stronger communities across this city." The presentation went smoothly, and by the time Elijah finished, the room was filled with applause. The city council members asked a few questions, and both Elijah and Marcus answered them confidently. When the meeting ended, the mayor approached them, offering his support and discussing possible partnerships that could help Miles of Care grow even further. As they left the council chambers, Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The expansion was becoming a reality, and with it, the chance to help even more people. But more than that, Elijah realized something important. It wasn't just about the size of the organization or the number of people they served. It was about the impact they had on each individual, on each family, and on the community as a whole. The legacy of kindness he had started wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in the lives that had been touched and the connections that had been formed. Later that evening, Elijah found himself back at the Miles of Care Center, reflecting on how far he had come. He walked through the halls, greeting volunteers, and chatting with some of the seniors who had come by for their weekly groceries. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of the impact Miles of Care had made. Smiling faces, warm greetings, and a sense of belonging that filled the air. As Elijah stood at the entrance, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, Marcus joined him, leaning against the doorframe. "You know," Marcus said, his voice soft, "when I first offered to buy you that van, I had no idea it would turn into this." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "Neither did I. It's still hard to believe sometimes." "But you did it," Marcus continued. "You turned a simple act of kindness into something that's going to last for generations. That's no small thing." Elijah looked out at the community, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. He had never set out to create a legacy, but that's exactly what he had done. And it wasn't just his legacy, it belonged to everyone who had been part of the journey, from the volunteers to the seniors to the families who had received help. "It wasn't just me," Elijah said quietly. "It was all of us. And it'll keep going because people care." Marcus smiled. "That's the beauty of it. It started with you, but now it belongs to everyone." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long, filled with challenges, doubts, and countless miles. But it had been worth every step. He had built something that would endure, something that would continue to bring people together, long after he was gone. Miles of Care wasn't just an organization. It was a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the belief that no matter how small the act, every effort to help someone in need made a difference. Elijah knew that the legacy of what they had built would continue, carried forward by the people who believed in the same simple truth that had guided him from the very beginning, that when we care for each other, we all walk a little farther together. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.